Imagine leaving home, knowing you were about to take part in the greatest expedition your country had ever attempted. Imagine standing on the deck of a magnificent ship, watching the shoreline disappear as hundreds of people wave goodbye, convinced they would one day welcome you back as a hero. Now imagine that no one would ever see you again. Not your family, not your friends, not your homeland. Your ship would vanish. Your captain would become a legend. Your crew would become a mystery. For generations, people would search the frozen Arctic looking for clues, finding only scattered bones, abandoned camps, and whispers carried through the ice. This is not a legend. It is not a novel. It is one of the greatest true stories almost no one remembers. In the summer of 1845, 129 men boarded two of the most advanced ships ever built by the British Royal Navy. They carried enough food to survive for years, cutting-edge technology, experienced officers, and a confidence and empire that believed nothing was impossible. Their mission seemed simple on paper: find the Northwest Passage, connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through the Arctic, complete a dream explorers had chased for centuries. Whoever succeeded would forever change global navigation and secure a permanent place in history. Britain believed they had finally assembled the perfect expedition. The best ships, the best equipment, the most experienced commander available. Everything suggested success. Instead, what followed became one of history's greatest disappearances. Years passed without a single message. Then decades. Search parties crossed thousands of miles of frozen wilderness. Dozens of rescue missions risked their own lives trying to uncover the truth. Every discovery created even more questions. Why had the ships been abandoned? Why were supplies left behind? What forced trained Royal Navy sailors to walk across endless ice carrying heavy boats by hand? And how could 129 men simply vanish from the face of the earth? Even today, after modern archaeology, underwater exploration, and advanced forensic science, historians continue debating exactly what happened during those final terrible months. Some believe disease destroyed them. Others blame starvation. Some point to poisoned food. Others believe nature itself became an enemy no human being could overcome. But perhaps the most tragic part of this story is not how these men died. It is how easily the world forgot what they endured. Tonight, we will travel back to the 19th century and follow their journey from the moment they left England until the frozen silence swallowed every last one of them. This is a story of courage, ambition, suffering, hope, and one of the most dangerous journeys in human history. A journey that almost no one remembers. To understand why this expedition became one of history's greatest mysteries, we must first travel back to an era when much of the world still remained unexplored. The year was 1845. The British Empire stood at the height of its power. Its navy dominated the oceans, its merchants reached every continent, and its influence stretched farther than any nation in history. Around the world, British maps continued to grow as explorers charted rivers, mountains, deserts, and coastlines that Europeans had never fully understood. Yet despite all of Britain's achievements, one challenge remained unconquered: the Northwest Passage. For centuries, sailors had dreamed of discovering a navigable route to the frozen Arctic that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Such a passage promised to transform global trade forever. Ships traveling between Europe and Asia would no longer need to sail around the southern tip of Africa or endure the dangerous journey around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. The route would shorten voyages by thousands of miles. It would save fortunes. It would strengthen empires. Whoever found it would earn a place among the greatest explorers who had ever lived. But the Arctic was unlike any place on Earth. It did not negotiate. It did not forgive mistakes. The region was a kingdom ruled by ice, darkness, and unimaginable cold. Entire seas could freeze solid for months at a time. Massive sheets of drifting ice crushed wooden ships like toys. Temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin could freeze within minutes. During winter, the sun disappeared for weeks, leaving explorers trapped in endless darkness while violent winds howled across the frozen landscape. Many expeditions had already tried. Many had failed. Some ships returned badly damaged. Others never returned at all. Still, each failed attempt only fueled Britain's determination. Every unsuccessful expedition revealed another piece of the Arctic puzzle. New coastlines were mapped. New islands were discovered. Small sections of the passage slowly emerged from the blank spaces that had once covered British charts. By the mid-19th century, many experts believed success was finally within reach. Technology had improved. Navigation instruments were more accurate than ever before. Steam power was beginning to assist sailing vessels. Preserved food could now sustain large crews for years instead of months. The Royal Navy believed it possessed everything previous explorers had lacked. All that remained was finding the right leader. That man was Sir John Franklin. Franklin was not the youngest officer in the Navy. He was not the strongest. He was not even the first choice for the mission. At 59 years old, he had already spent decades exploring some of the harshest environments on Earth. He had survived freezing temperatures, starvation, and exhausting overland expeditions across northern Canada. His earlier journeys had earned him both admiration and criticism. Some praised his courage and calm leadership under impossible conditions. Others questioned decisions that had nearly cost the lives of his men. But no one doubted one thing. John Franklin understood hardship better than almost anyone alive. His experience made him the perfect symbol of Britain's determination. If anyone could finally conquer the Arctic, many believed it was him. The Admiralty spared no expense preparing the expedition. Two powerful bomb vessels, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were selected for the mission. Although originally designed for warfare, both ships had already proven themselves capable of surviving brutal polar conditions during earlier Antarctic expeditions. Their wooden hulls were reinforced with thick layers of oak and iron plating to resist crushing ice. Steam engines were installed to provide additional power whenever the wind failed. Special heating systems were fitted inside the ships to improve living conditions during the endless Arctic winters. Thousands upon thousands of canned meals were loaded into their storage rooms. Medical supplies filled entire compartments. Scientific instruments carefully packed into protective crates awaited discoveries that could change humanity's understanding of the northern world. Everything about the expedition reflected confidence. Confidence in British engineering. Confidence in British science. Confidence in British leadership. Most importantly, confidence that nature itself could finally be conquered. Newspapers followed every stage of the preparations with excitement. Crowds gathered at the docks. Families proudly watched sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers prepare to sail toward history. No one standing on those crowded piers could possibly imagine that they were witnessing the final moments those men would ever spend on British soil. Within only a few years, their names would disappear beneath the Arctic ice, and for generations afterward, the world would desperately search for answers hidden inside one of the coldest places on Earth. Long before his name became forever linked to one of history's greatest mysteries, Sir John Franklin had already earned a reputation that few men of his generation could match. He was born in 1786 in the quiet English town of Spilsby, Lincolnshire, far from the frozen wilderness that would one day define his legacy. His father hoped he would enter the church, believing a life of faith would offer security and respectability. But from an early age, young John found himself fascinated by something entirely different: the sea. Stories of great voyages, distant continents, and fearless captains filled his imagination. Every ship that disappeared beyond the horizon seemed to carry the promise of another world waiting to be discovered. While other boys dreamed of comfortable lives close to home, Franklin dreamed of storms, unexplored coastlines, and places no European had ever seen. At just 14 years old, he entered the Royal Navy. It was the beginning of a career that would span more than 4 decades. The young officer matured during one of the most turbulent periods in British history. Europe was engulfed by the Napoleonic Wars, and Britain's navy became the shield that protected the empire from invasion. Franklin served aboard several warships, learning discipline, navigation, leadership, and, perhaps most importantly, endurance. Life at sea during the early 19th century was brutally unforgiving. Food spoiled quickly. Disease spread through cramped wooden decks. Storms could destroy ships without warning. A single mistake during battle often meant death. Every surviving officer carried physical scars, emotional burdens, and hard-earned wisdom that could never be taught inside a classroom. Franklin absorbed every lesson. Unlike some ambitious officers driven by personal glory, he developed a reputation for calmness under pressure. Fellow sailors described him as thoughtful, patient, and deeply committed to the welfare of those serving under his command. He was not loud or theatrical. His authority came from quiet confidence rather than dramatic speeches. Those qualities would later make him an obvious candidate for exploration. But before that happened, he would experience hardships few people could imagine. In 1819, Franklin was selected to lead an overland expedition across northern Canada. The objective seemed straightforward: map unknown sections of the Arctic coastline and gather valuable geographical information for the British Admiralty. Instead, the expedition descended into catastrophe. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Game became increasingly scarce. The landscape itself seemed determined to resist every attempt at survival. Weeks turned into months. The men survived on tiny portions of food. Eventually, they were forced to eat whatever they could find: moss, lichens, leather cut from their own equipment, even boiled animal bones that had long since lost every trace of nutrition. Every meal became a desperate struggle against starvation. Several members of the expedition never made it home. Others barely survived. Franklin himself lost a tremendous amount of weight and came frighteningly close to death. The ordeal shocked Britain. Newspapers described the unimaginable suffering endured by the expedition. Readers struggled to believe that officers of the Royal Navy had been reduced to eating scraps simply to remain alive. The public soon gave Franklin an unusual nickname: the man who ate his boots. Although the phrase was partly exaggerated, it reflected the horrifying reality of what his expedition had endured. Many men would have retired after such an experience. Franklin did the opposite. He volunteered for more exploration. Over the following years, he returned repeatedly to the Arctic, determined to finish what earlier expeditions had begun. Each journey expanded Britain's knowledge of the northern coastline. Every mile mapped reduced the unknown areas that had challenged explorers for centuries. His persistence impressed the Admiralty. Failure had not broken him. It had strengthened him. Unlike younger officers who underestimated the Arctic, Franklin understood exactly what kind of enemy awaited beyond the northern seas. He knew the cold was relentless. He knew food shortages could become deadly. He knew morale could collapse long before supplies disappeared. Most importantly, he respected nature. By the early 1840s, Britain had reached an important crossroads. Large sections of the Northwest Passage had already been mapped from both the east and the west. Only a relatively small portion remained unexplored. Many influential officials believed the final breakthrough was now only one expedition away. The Admiralty debated who should command this historic mission. Several names were considered. Some officers declined. Others were considered too inexperienced. Eventually, attention returned to Franklin. He was older than many expected. At 59, he was approaching an age when most naval officers were preparing for retirement rather than embarking on the most dangerous voyage of their lives. Some privately questioned whether he still possessed the physical endurance required for such a demanding mission, but experience outweighed youth. No living British officer had spent more time facing the Arctic than John Franklin. His name inspired confidence among politicians, scientists, naval officers, and the British public alike. If anyone could finally complete the Northwest Passage, surely it was a man who had already survived everything the frozen North could throw at him. When the official appointment was announced, newspapers celebrated the decision. The country viewed the expedition not as a desperate gamble, but as the final chapter in a story that Britain was destined to finish. No one imagined they were actually witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would haunt historians for nearly 2 centuries. John Franklin accepted the responsibility with quiet determination. He understood the risks better than anyone. He knew many men would never volunteer for such a journey. Yet he also understood that opportunities like this came only once in a lifetime. If the expedition succeeded, Britain's greatest geographical dream would finally become reality. If it failed, no one yet understood how completely the Arctic could erase even the strongest men from history. When the British Admiralty announced the Franklin expedition, it was not only placing its trust in an experienced commander, it was placing its faith in technology. Throughout history, explorers had often been defeated not because they lacked courage, but because their ships were never designed to survive the places they attempted to conquer. The Arctic demanded something different. Ordinary vessels could withstand storms. They could cross oceans. They could fight wars. But they could not survive a sea that turned into solid stone every winter. The Arctic did not simply freeze around ships. It crushed them. As enormous sheets of ice drifted with invisible currents beneath the surface, they pressed against wooden hulls with unimaginable force. Entire expeditions had watched helplessly as ships splinter apart like fragile boxes, their crews left stranded hundreds of miles from civilization. The Royal Navy had learned from every one of those disasters. If Britain wanted to succeed where others had failed, it needed vessels unlike anything the world had ever seen. That is why two extraordinary ships were chosen, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Ironically, neither vessel had originally been built for exploration. Both had been constructed decades earlier as bomb ships, powerful warships designed to withstand the tremendous recoil generated by massive naval mortars. To survive those explosions, their frames have been built far stronger than ordinary ships, with exceptionally thick oak timbers and heavily reinforced internal structures. That strength will become their greatest advantage. Instead of firing explosive shells at enemy fortresses, they would now face an even more relentless opponent, nature itself. Before the expedition departed, engineers transformed both ships into floating fortresses capable of surviving conditions no previous expedition had dared to challenge. Their hulls were wrapped with additional layers of iron plating. Heavy internal beams strengthened every section of the ships, allowing them to resist the crushing pressure of drifting ice far better than traditional naval vessels. Special protective coverings reinforced the bows, where impacts with frozen seas would be most severe. Every improvement reflected one assumption: the ships would become trapped. The question was not whether that would happen. The question was whether they could survive it. For the first time in Arctic exploration, steam engines were also installed aboard both vessels. Although relatively small by modern standards, these engines represented cutting-edge technology in 1845. They allowed the ships to continue moving even when winds disappeared, offering precious control while navigating dangerous channels between drifting ice. The engines themselves had an unusual history. Rather than being designed specifically for exploration, they had been adapted from railway locomotives. Britain's rapidly expanding rail industry had become a symbol of industrial progress, and now some of that revolutionary technology was heading into one of the harshest environments on Earth. Massive propellers could even be lifted out of the water whenever necessary, reducing the risk of damage from floating ice. Every detail had been carefully considered. Inside the ships, life was expected to be surprisingly comfortable. Heating systems circulated warm air through living quarters, reducing the deadly effects of the endless Arctic winters. Water distillation equipment provided cleaner drinking water. Libraries filled with books offered intellectual escape during months of isolation. Scientific laboratories allowed officers to conduct experiments, record magnetic observations, and collect valuable information about the polar environment. There were musical instruments, games, writing materials, everything thought necessary to preserve morale during years away from home. Food received equal attention. The expedition carried enough provisions to feed every crew member for approximately 3 years. Thousands upon thousands of preserved meals were carefully packed into storage compartments. Salted meat, dried vegetables, soup concentrates, tea, coffee, flour, sugar, lemon juice intended to prevent scurvy. Even small luxuries that could lift spirits during long winters. The amount of supplies astonished contemporary observers. Many believed starvation would simply never become an issue. No previous Arctic expedition had ever departed so thoroughly prepared. Weapons were equally impressive. The crews carried muskets, pistols, ammunition, and explosive charges, not because they expected to fight other nations, but because the Arctic had its own dangers. Polar bears, wolves, and the unknown. Navigation equipment represented the finest scientific achievement of the era. Precision chronometers, advanced sextants, detailed charts compiled from generations of previous explorers, magnetic instruments capable of recording valuable scientific data. Every officer understood they were not merely sailors. They were explorers, scientists, cartographers, representatives of the greatest empire on Earth. The crews themselves reflected that same confidence. 129 carefully selected men served aboard the 2 ships. Most were experienced Royal Navy sailors. Many had already survived difficult voyages. Several volunteered specifically because they believed this expedition would secure their place in history. To them, danger was simply part of the profession. The atmosphere before departure was one of optimism. Britain had never assembled a stronger Arctic expedition, never invested more resources, never combined so much experience with so much technology. The newspapers praised the ships as engineering marvels. Politicians proudly described the mission as the inevitable final step toward conquering the Northwest Passage. Families watched with pride as husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers prepared to leave. Few doubted they would return. Some even imagined the celebrations that would welcome them home after completing one of humanity's greatest geographical achievements. Looking back today, that confidence feels heartbreaking, because despite every innovation, despite every scientific advance, despite every reinforced beam, every steam engine, every carefully packed crate of food, none of it would be enough. Within only a few years, the mighty Erebus and Terror would disappear beneath the frozen silence of the Arctic, and for more than a century and a half, no one would know where they had gone. The morning of May 19th, 1845, began like countless others along the River Thames. The sky hung low over the water, softened by a thin blanket of clouds that allowed only scattered rays of sunlight to break through. A cool breeze drifted across the docks, carrying the familiar scent of salt water, coal smoke, damp timber, and fresh rope. Sailors shouted commands as workers loaded the final supplies aboard two ships that had already become the pride of the Royal Navy. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like another naval departure. But for those standing on the crowded docks, it felt like history unfolding before their eyes. Word of the expedition had spread throughout London weeks earlier. Newspapers had described it as Britain's greatest attempt to solve the last great geographical mystery of the age. Curiosity drew spectators from every corner of the city. Families traveled long distances simply to witness the departure of the men who would attempt what generations of explorers had failed to achieve. Among the crowd stood wives holding the hands of young children. Elderly parents leaned on walking sticks, trying to hide their worry behind proud smiles. Brothers embraced one another. Friends laughed together, pretending the coming separation would be brief. Everyone wanted their final memory to be a happy one. No one imagined these simple conversations would become their last. On the decks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, the atmosphere mixed excitement with quiet concentration. The crews moved confidently between ropes, sails, crates, and equipment, completing the countless final tasks required before a long voyage. Every man had trained for moments like this. Every officer understood his responsibilities without needing lengthy instructions. The expedition had been planned with remarkable precision. Supplies had been counted repeatedly. Scientific instruments carefully inspected. Navigation charts secured inside waterproof containers. Weapons cleaned. Medical equipment organized. Food inventories checked once again. Nothing had been left to chance. Sir John Franklin walked calmly through both ships during the final preparations. Observers later recalled how composed he appeared. There was no dramatic speech, no grand display of confidence. He greeted officers quietly, exchanged brief conversations with crew members, and inspected the vessels one final time. His calmness reassured everyone around him. If Franklin showed no fear, why should anyone else? Many of the sailors shared that same confidence. Some had already served in dangerous waters. Others viewed the expedition as the greatest opportunity of their careers. To them, the Arctic represented adventure, honor, and the possibility of returning home as heroes. The risks seemed real, but manageable. After all, these were the finest ships Britain had ever sent north. As departure drew closer, the mood along the docks slowly changed. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became more forced. Children who had spent the morning playing suddenly realized their fathers were actually leaving. Some began to cry. Mothers held them tightly while trying to hide tears of their own. Letters were exchanged. Small family keepsakes changed hands. Pocket watches, tiny Bibles, photographs, locks of hair tied carefully inside folded pieces of paper. Simple objects that carried enormous emotional weight. Many families promised to write often, even though they understood those letters might never reach the Arctic before the expedition returned. The distance separating Britain from the frozen north seemed enormous, yet few believed the separation would last more than 2 or 3 years. As the tide turned favorable, final orders echoed across the water. Ropes were released. Sails caught the wind. Steam engines quietly assisted as the ships began moving away from the docks. A great cheer erupted from the crowd. Hats were raised high into the air. Handkerchiefs waved from every direction. Voices called out blessings, prayers, and promises to meet again. The sailors answered with smiles and waves. Some climbed into the rigging for one last look at their families. Others remained silent, choosing instead to fix the faces of their loved ones firmly in memory. Slowly, the distance between shore and ship began to grow. The cheers faded beneath the sound of gulls and water splashing against the hulls. London gradually disappeared behind morning mist. For many aboard the expedition, it was the final sight they would ever have a home. The journey north progressed smoothly. After crossing the English Channel, the expedition stopped briefly at the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland to collect additional supplies and a few live animals that would provide fresh meat during the early weeks of the voyage. From there, the ships crossed the North Atlantic toward Greenland. The weather remained surprisingly favorable. Crew members settled into daily routines. Scientists began recording observations. Officers checked navigation instruments constantly. Everything appeared to confirm what Britain had hoped. The expedition was unfolding exactly as planned. When the ships reached Disco Bay on Greenland's western coast, they paused one final time before entering the true Arctic. Extra provisions were loaded aboard. Several transport vessels that had accompanied the expedition prepared to return home. It was here that the final letters from many crew members were handed over for delivery back to England. Those letters spoke of optimism, of excitement, of confidence. They described healthy crews, excellent ships, and high spirits. None hinted at fear. None suggested disaster. Reading those letters today is deeply moving. The men believed they stood at the beginning of the greatest adventure of their lives. They could not know they were also writing the final words many of them would ever send home. In late July, while sailing through Baffin Bay, the expedition encountered 2 British whaling ships. The captains greeted Franklin and briefly exchanged information about weather and ice conditions. Nothing appeared unusual. The crew seemed healthy. The ships looked strong. After friendly conversation, the vessels separated. The whalers continued south. Franklin continued north. As the distance between them increased, no one aboard the whaling ships realized they had just become the last Europeans ever to see the Erebus and the Terror, with all 129 men still alive. The Arctic swallowed them soon afterward, silently, without warning, without witnesses. And for the next 170 years, the frozen horizon beyond that meeting would remain one of the greatest unanswered mysteries in the history of exploration. By the end of July 1845, the Franklin expedition had already traveled farther north than most people would ever dream of going. Behind them lay the green hills of Britain, the familiar ports, the crowded cities, the warmth of home. Ahead stretched an endless world of cold water, towering icebergs, drifting sea ice, and silence so complete that many sailors later described the Arctic as a place where time itself seemed to slow. For the men aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, the excitement had not yet faded. The voyage had unfolded almost exactly as planned. The ships had crossed the Atlantic safely. Supplies remained plentiful. Morale was high. The officers maintained strict routines, ensuring every sailor remained occupied with work, maintenance, navigation, or scientific observation. Experience had taught the Royal Navy that discipline was essential during long expeditions. Idle minds often became fearful minds. Keeping the crew busy meant keeping the crew confident. Every morning followed a familiar rhythm. Decks were cleaned, equipment inspected, weather observations recorded, navigation instruments checked with meticulous precision. Meals were served at regular intervals. Whenever weather allowed, men gathered above deck to admire landscapes unlike anything they had ever seen. Gigantic icebergs floated silently across the sea. Some rose hundreds of feet above the water. Their brilliant white surfaces reflected sunlight with almost blinding intensity. Others glowed faint shades of blue, revealing ancient ice compressed over thousands of years. The Arctic was beautiful, almost impossibly beautiful, but beneath that beauty hid unimaginable danger. The sea itself constantly changed. Open water could disappear within hours. Floating ice drifted with invisible currents. Passages that appeared safe one day could become deadly traps the next. Every decision depended on weather, wind, temperature, and luck. No chart could predict what the Arctic intended to do tomorrow. As July drew to a close, Franklin's ships entered Baffin Bay. This vast stretch of water served as one of the final gateways before explorers reached the maze of islands, channels, and frozen seas that made up the Canadian Arctic archipelago. It was here, on July 26, that fate quietly arranged one final meeting. Two British whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, had been operating in the region during the annual whaling season. Their captains, experienced Arctic sailors themselves, spotted Franklin's expedition approaching to the cold northern waters. Meetings between British vessels so far from home were uncommon, but always welcome. The captains exchanged greetings, information about weather conditions, reports on drifting ice, general observations about the voyage ahead. Nothing about the encounter suggested anything unusual. The Erebus and the Terror appeared strong, well supplied, perfectly organized. Crew members could be seen moving confidently across the decks. Officers spoke calmly. No signs of illness were immediately apparent. No indication of mechanical problems. No hint that disaster waited just beyond the horizon. Captain Martin Dunbar, the Prince of Wales, later recalled that Franklin himself seemed relaxed and optimistic. The expedition intended to continue westward as soon as ice conditions allowed. The officers believed they still had enough time before winter arrived. Like nearly everyone else in Britain, they expected success. After all, every previous stage of the journey had unfolded almost perfectly. No one had any reason to suspect those few hours of conversation would become historically significant. Eventually, the ships separated. The whalers turned south. Franklin continued north. No dramatic farewell took place. No emotional speeches. No sense of impending tragedy. Just professional sailors wishing one another safe travels before disappearing toward different horizons. As the distance between them increased, the outlines of Erebus and Terror slowly faded into the Arctic mist. Within hours, they became little more than dark shapes against the frozen sea. Then, they vanished completely. Neither Captain Dunbar nor anyone aboard the whaling ships realized they had just witnessed history. Those two vessels would become the final confirmed European observers ever to see Franklin's expedition alive. From that moment onward, everything that happened depended entirely on scattered evidence left behind in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. No journals would return. No official reports would arrive. No survivor would tell the complete story. Only fragments. Silence followed. Months passed. Back in Britain, almost no one worried. Communication with Arctic expeditions was impossible during winter. Long periods without news were expected. Families continued their daily lives believing their loved ones were somewhere beyond the northern horizon, busy making discoveries that would soon capture the imagination of the world. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the expedition with optimism. Maps printed in magazines highlighted the likely route. Scientists eagerly discussed the discoveries Franklin might eventually bring home. The entire nation waited patiently. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Arctic was quietly preparing to test every assumption Britain had made. The first hints of winter began appearing earlier than many expected. Temperatures dropped steadily. Thin sheets of ice formed across calm stretches of water each night before breaking apart during the warmer hours of the afternoon. Wildlife behavior also changed. Birds that filled the skies during summer gradually disappeared southward. Seals became harder to find. Even experienced sailors recognized these signs. The brief Arctic summer was ending. Soon, navigation would become far more dangerous. Still, Franklin pressed forward. Turning back too early would waste an entire season. Waiting another year meant delaying Britain's greatest geographical ambition. He had not traveled thousands of miles merely to retreat at the first sign of difficulty. Like every Arctic explorer before him, he believed determination could overcome nature. Perhaps it could, for a while, but the Arctic played by rules no empire could control. Far beyond the last human witnesses, beyond the final farewell, beyond the last hopeful letter sent home, the ice was already beginning to close. And with each passing day, the window of escape grew smaller. For weeks, the Franklin expedition continued pushing westward to the labyrinth of Arctic waters. Each mile carried them deeper into territory where almost no European had ever sailed. Behind them, the open sea slowly disappeared. Ahead lay a world of narrow channels, scattered islands, drifting ice, and endless uncertainty. At first, progress remained encouraging. The summer sun barely dipped below the horizon, providing nearly constant daylight. Long hours of visibility allowed the officers to study coastlines, identify landmarks, and carefully guide the Erebus and the Terror through gaps in the floating ice. To the men aboard the ships, it seemed as though nature itself was offering them an opportunity. The Arctic looked calm, welcoming, even, but appearances in the far north could be dangerously deceptive. Unlike the oceans farther south, the Arctic was alive. The sea never remained the same for long. Invisible currents carried enormous fields of ice across the water without warning. A channel that appeared completely open during breakfast could become blocked by afternoon. Massive sheets of frozen sea collided with one another, breaking apart with thunderous cracks before slowly drifting together again. Every decision demanded patience. Every mile had to be earned. The officers climbed into the rigging several times each day, scanning the horizon through telescopes in search of the safest route forward. Sometimes they celebrated after finding a narrow opening between the ice. Hours later, that same passage would no longer exist. Still, Franklin refused to lose momentum. Every explorer understood one simple truth. The Arctic summer was painfully short. Every day of delay increased the chances of becoming trapped before winter arrived. The expedition pressed onward whenever conditions allowed. Sailors worked constantly. Some stood watch from the highest points of the masts. Others used long poles to push dangerous chunks of ice away from the hulls. When necessary, small boats were lowered into the freezing water, so officers could examine channels too narrow for the ships to enter safely. Everyone understood the importance of every decision. One mistake could end the expedition. Then came the first warning. One morning, crew members noticed that the water surrounding the ships looked different. Thin crystals floated across its surface. At first, they resembled shattered pieces of glass. By evening, those crystals had begun joining together. A fragile skin of ice spread silently across the sea. The sailors had seen this before during previous Arctic voyages. There was no panic. Not yet. The following afternoon, the sun melted much of the way. Life continued as normal. But each night, the frozen layer returned. And each morning, it grew thicker. The Arctic was changing. Summer was slipping away. Soon afterward, temperatures began falling far more rapidly than expected. The cold no longer arrived only after sunset. It lingered throughout the day. Breath became visible with every conversation. Ropes stiffened. Metal burned exposed skin like fire. Fresh water froze inside uncovered containers. The ships themselves started making unfamiliar sounds. Deep groans echoed through their wooden frames as the expanding ice pressed gently against the reinforced hulls. At first, the noises seemed harmless, almost comforting, proof that the massive oak beams were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. But those sounds gradually became louder, longer, more frequent. The pressure surrounding the vessels increased day by day. The crew remained optimistic. After all, this possibility had always been part of the plan. The Erebus and the Terror had been specially reinforced for exactly this situation. No ordinary ship could survive such conditions. These could, at least, that was the belief. As September approached, open water became increasingly difficult to find. Instead of sailing freely, the expedition now advanced only in short bursts whenever shifting ice briefly opened a path. Some days they moved several miles. Other days, not at all. The Arctic had begun deciding where they could go. Not the captain, not the officers, not even the wind. Nature had quietly taken command. The men adapted as best they could. Daily routines continued. Meals were served. Scientific observations were recorded. Repairs were carried out whenever needed. Discipline remained strong. Outwardly, very little had changed. Yet beneath that routine, an uncomfortable realization slowly spread through both crews. Time was running out. Experienced Arctic sailors understood the warning signs. Birds had disappeared. The sea mammals that had been regularly spotted throughout the summer became increasingly rare. The air itself felt heavier, sharper. The brief northern summer was ending weeks faster than many had hoped. Then, one cold morning it happened. The ship stopped moving. Not because the wind had failed, not because the sails had been lowered, but because the sea itself had become solid. The drifting ice surrounding the expedition locked together like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Within hours, the Erebus and the Terror were no longer sailing. They were trapped. The crews immediately went to work. Axes struck fresh ice. Long poles pushed against frozen ridges. Steam engines were used in desperate attempts to force the ships forward. Nothing worked. Every effort accomplished almost nothing. The Arctic simply absorbed their determination without yielding an inch. Day after day, the ice thickened around the hulls. Soon it became impossible to distinguish where the sea ended and the land began. Everything was white. Everything was frozen. Everything was silent. Franklin gathered his senior officers. No detailed record survives of what was said during those discussions, but historians believe the situation was not yet considered hopeless. Many previous expeditions had wintered successfully in the Arctic before continuing once the following summer melted the surrounding ice. Perhaps this would simply become another temporary delay. The supplies were abundant. The ships remained undamaged. The men were healthy. There was every reason to believe they could wait. But the Arctic had already begun writing a very different ending. The sea that had carried them north had quietly transformed into a prison of ice. And with every passing hour, its walls grew thicker. At first, no one aboard the Erebus or the Terror believed they were facing disaster. Becoming trapped in Arctic ice was not entirely unexpected. Previous expeditions had survived frozen winters before. The plan had always allowed for delays. The reinforced ships had been designed to endure crushing ice, and the expedition carried enough provisions to wait patiently until warmer weather returned. If the ice refused to release them before winter, they would simply stay where they were. When spring arrived, they would continue west. At least that was the hope. As September faded into October, the Arctic transformed with astonishing speed. The endless daylight of summer disappeared. Each afternoon became shorter than the last. The pale northern sun barely climbed above the horizon before sinking once again beneath distant mountains of ice. Long shadows stretched across the frozen landscape. Soon, darkness became the expedition's constant companion. For men who had spent their entire lives following the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the change was unsettling. The Arctic ignored the rules of the world they knew. Days lost their meaning. Morning blended into evening. Time itself became strangely difficult to measure. Inside the ships, officers worked hard to preserve routine. The bell continued marking the hours. Meals were served at fixed times. Daily inspections never stopped. Scientific observations were carefully recorded whenever weather permitted. Maintaining discipline was more than naval tradition. It was psychological survival. Franklin understood that disorder could destroy a crew long before hunger or cold ever did. The men cleaned the decks every morning, even though snow covered them again within hours. Equipment was inspected repeatedly. Weapons were maintained. Clothing repaired. Every task, no matter how small, reminded the sailors that they remained professional seamen rather than helpless prisoners. Outside, however, nature steadily tightened its grip. The ice surrounding the ships thickened every day. What had once been floating sheets became an enormous frozen plain stretching in every direction. From the deck, it no longer looked as though the vessels rested upon the sea. Instead, they appeared trapped inside a vast white desert. No waves, no moving water, only endless silence. Sometimes that silence became almost unbearable. Then, without warning, it shattered. Deep beneath the surface, the shifting ice produced sounds unlike anything most of the crew had ever heard. Long groans echoed through the frozen sea. Sharp cracks exploded across the landscape like distant cannon fire. Heavy pressure forced enormous ridges of ice upward, creating frozen walls taller than a man. The noise could continue for hours. Many sailors admitted those sounds frightened them more than storms. You could not see the force creating them, only hear it. Some described the Arctic as if it were alive, breathing, stretching, watching. The temperature continued falling. Each passing week brought colder air than the last. Moisture inside cabins froze against wooden walls. Metal tools became painful to touch with bare hands. Ink thickened inside bottles, making writing increasingly difficult. Even sleeping became a challenge. Despite heating systems installed aboard both ships, warmth never reached every corner equally. Crew members often woke to find frost-covering blankets, boots, and personal belongings. Every breath produced tiny clouds inside the cabins. Outside, survival demanded constant vigilance. A few minutes without proper gloves could freeze exposed fingers. Skin touching cold metal risked sticking instantly to its surface. Beards collected tiny crystals of ice after only a short walk across the deck. Yet, remarkably, morale remained surprisingly strong. The officers organized activities whenever possible. Books circulated between crew members. Some sailors played music. Others wrote journals describing the strange beauty surrounding them. Religious services continued regularly. Holiday celebrations were carefully planned months in advance. The approaching Christmas became an important symbol. If the men could celebrate together, laugh together, and maintain hope together, then surely they could survive until spring. Many genuinely believed they would. No one knew exactly how long the ice would hold them, but patience had always been part of Arctic exploration. The food stores remained impressive. Medical supplies appeared adequate. The ships themselves showed no serious structural damage. Everything suggested the expedition still possessed the resources needed to endure one difficult winter. Even Franklin appeared calm. He encouraged his officers to maintain optimism. Every decision reflected confidence rather than panic. From the outside, leadership remained steady, but privately, some experienced Arctic veterans began noticing details that troubled them. The cold seemed harsher than expected, the ice thicker, the movement of the frozen sea slower. Older sailors quietly compared this winter to previous expeditions. Something felt different. No one could fully explain why. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps experience, or perhaps they simply recognized something younger men did not. The Arctic had no obligation to release them when spring arrived. Nature had never signed that agreement. Far beyond the warm homes of Britain, where families still imagined their loved ones sailing triumphantly toward discovery, 129 men settled into the long polar night. They waited, they worked, they hoped, and as darkness swallowed the horizon for weeks at a time, none of them could know they had already crossed an invisible line. They were no longer visitors passing through the Arctic. The Arctic had claimed them, whether temporarily or forever, remained a question that only time and the ice would answer. Winter eventually became something no calendar could fully describe. The men aboard the Erebus and the Terror had stopped asking what day it was. Instead, they measured time by routines, by meals, by watches, by the endless cycle of darkness that surrounded them. The Arctic no longer felt like a place they were passing through. It felt like an enormous prison with invisible walls stretching beyond the horizon. Still, hope remained. Every man aboard both ships believed the same thing. Spring would come, the sun would return, the ice would melt, the ships would sail again. That belief became the foundation of their survival. Every sacrifice suddenly seemed temporary. Every hardship had an ending. They simply needed patience. As the first weeks of 1846 passed, the officers continued monitoring the condition of the ice with remarkable discipline. Almost every day, small groups left the ships carrying measuring poles and surveying equipment. They carefully examined cracks, measured thickness, recorded temperatures, observed wind direction. Every tiny change mattered. Every new fracture offered hope. Every frozen ridge brought disappointment. At first, there were encouraging signs. During occasional warmer afternoons, the surface softened slightly. Thin pools of water appeared above sections of older ice. Some sailors smiled for the first time in weeks. Perhaps winter truly was ending. Perhaps freedom was finally approaching. Then the temperatures dropped again, harder than before. The brief signs of melting disappeared almost overnight. The ice returned thicker than ever. It was as though the Arctic had allowed them a glimpse of hope, only to take it away again. As spring slowly arrived across Europe, life returned to farms, villages, and cities thousands of miles away. Trees blossomed, birds sang, families opened windows to fresh air. Children played beneath warm sunshine. None of that reached Franklin's expedition. The Arctic ignored the seasons that governed the rest of the world. Snowstorms still swept across the frozen landscape. The wind carried razor-sharp crystals that stung exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Visibility sometimes dropped to only a few feet. During the worst storms, the ships disappeared completely beneath blowing snow, becoming little more than ghostly shapes buried inside an endless white void. Inside the vessels, optimism slowly began to weaken, not because supplies had failed, not because the ships were damaged, but because the ice simply refused to move. Day after day, week after week, month after month, nothing changed. The enormous frozen plain surrounding the expedition remained solid. The officers ordered additional attempts to free the ships. Entire work parties marched onto the ice, carrying axes, saws, and heavy iron tools. For hours they hacked through frozen barriers. Some cut channels several feet wide. Others broke apart smaller ridges, blocking possible escape routes. The work was exhausting. Every swing of an axe echoed across the frozen silence. Every breath filled their lungs with painfully cold air. By the end of each day, the men returned exhausted. The results barely justified the effort. The Arctic erased their progress almost immediately. Fresh ice formed overnight. Wind pushed new frozen slabs into every opening they created. It felt as though nature repaired itself faster than human beings could destroy it. The steam engines were started again. Their powerful machinery vibrated through the wooden hulls. Dark smoke drifted into the pale Arctic sky. For brief moments, the propellers churned against icy water beneath the ships. Crew members watched hopefully from the decks. Perhaps the combination of steam power and human labor would finally break them free. Nothing happened. The ships shuddered. The engines strained. The ice remained perfectly still. Eventually, the officers ordered the engines shut down to conserve precious fuel. Silence returned once more. That silence began affecting the men in unexpected ways. Some found themselves listening for sounds that never came. The crash of waves, the cries of seabirds, the creaking of sails filled with wind. Simple noises they had barely noticed during ordinary voyages suddenly became treasured memories. Instead, they heard only wind, ice, and their own footsteps. Isolation settled over the expedition like another layer of snow. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became less frequent. Some sailors spent long periods staring through frost-covered windows toward the frozen horizon, as though willing the sea to move through determination alone. Others buried themselves in work, refusing to think about what might happen if another winter arrived before they escaped. Franklin continued projecting confidence. His officers followed his example. Outwardly, leadership remained calm. Orders were clear. Discipline never faltered. Routine continued. But privately, questions had begun appearing. How long could the ships remain trapped? Would food last exactly as expected? Could the reinforced hull survive another year under constant pressure? Most importantly, what if summer came and nothing changed? No one dared speak those fears aloud. Not yet. Doing so felt almost like surrender. Then, during one routine inspection, several officers climbed a nearby ridge of ice to study the horizon. What they saw sent a quiet wave of unease through the expedition. There was no open water, not a narrow channel, not a distant patch of dark sea. Only ice, in every direction, as far as the eye could see. The realization spread slowly through both crews. The ships were no longer trapped beside the ice. They were trapped inside it. And for the first time since leaving England, even the most optimistic men aboard the Erebus and the Terror began to understand a terrifying possibility. The Arctic might never let them go. By the summer of 1846, every man aboard the Erebus and the Terror had expected to be sailing again. Instead, They woke each morning to the same view, an endless plain of frozen white stretching toward every horizon. The sea had not returned. The ice had not broken. The ships had not moved. For nearly a year, they had remained prisoners of the Arctic. At first, the crew tried to convince themselves that another few weeks would change everything. Perhaps the thaw had arrived later than usual. Perhaps stronger winds would eventually break apart the frozen pack. Perhaps the currents beneath the ice simply needed more time. Hope, however, became increasingly difficult to defend. Every observation pointed toward the same frightening conclusion. The Arctic was refusing to release them. Despite this, life aboard the ships continued with remarkable discipline. Franklin understood that allowing despair to spread would be just as dangerous as the cold itself. Every morning, bells announced the beginning of another working day. Cabins were cleaned, equipment inspected, scientific observations recorded, meals prepared, guards assigned. Every task reinforced the illusion that the expedition still controlled its own future. But beneath that routine, something had begun to change. Quietly, almost invisibly, it started with small complaints. A sailor mentioned unusual tiredness after simple work. Another admitted his legs felt strangely weak. Someone else developed persistent pain in his joints. No one considered these symptoms especially alarming. Months trapped inside a frozen ship naturally exhausted even the healthiest men. The officers expected fatigue. They expected frustration. They even expected occasional illness. After all, the expedition had already endured one brutal Arctic winter. The ship's surgeon examined the affected sailors carefully. Most appeared healthy enough. No obvious injuries. No dangerous fevers. No epidemic spreading through the crew. Yet something about the complaints felt unusual. Healthy men seemed to recover more slowly from ordinary work. Simple tasks required greater effort. Some sailors who once climbed rigging effortlessly now paused halfway to catch their breath. Others complained that cuts and bruises took longer than usual to heal. No one yet understood why. The food stores remained abundant. Every inventory confirmed that enough provisions still existed for many more months. Meals continued arriving on schedule. Salted beef, preserved vegetables, biscuits, tea, soup. Everything appeared exactly as planned. Yet appearances could be deceiving. Unknown to the officers, many of the canned food supplied before departure had been produced under enormous pressure to meet government deadlines. Factories had rushed production. Quality inspections were inconsistent. Some cans had not been sealed properly. Others contained poorly prepared food. At the time, can preservation was still a relatively new technology. Its long-term reliability had never been tested under conditions like those now faced by Franklin's expedition. No one aboard either ship could possibly know this. The supplies looked normal. Most tasted acceptable. No obvious signs of spoilage appeared. The danger remained invisible. At the same time, another hidden threat may already have been affecting the crew. Many historians believe the expedition's water systems and food containers exposed the men to dangerous levels of lead. The ships themselves contained extensive plumbing. The canned food was sealed using lead-based solder. Day after day, month after month, tiny amounts of the heavy metal may have entered their bodies. Modern science has linked prolonged lead exposure to fatigue, confusion, weakness, digestive problems, and impaired decision-making. Whether this alone caused the expedition's downfall remains heavily debated. Some researchers argue the effects have been exaggerated. Others believe it quietly undermined the health of the entire crew long before anyone realized something was wrong. The men themselves had no way of knowing. Lead poisoning was poorly understood in 1846. They could only describe what they felt: weakness, exhaustion, persistent discomfort. Meanwhile, outside the ships, nature continued applying relentless pressure. The ice groaned day and night. Powerful forces beneath the surface shifted enormous frozen masses against the reinforced hulls. Sometimes the entire vessel trembled. Loose objects rattled across tables. Sleep became difficult. Every loud crack raised the same terrifying question: would the next one break the ship apart? The officers constantly inspected the hulls. So far, the massive oak frames held firm. The engineering remained extraordinary. But even the strongest would have limits. Every passing month increased the strain. Inside the cabins, another enemy slowly emerged. Monotony. There were only so many books to read, only so many conversations to have, only so many games to play. The same faces, the same walls, the same frozen horizon, every single day. For men accustomed to movement, purpose, and progress, the endless repetition became psychologically exhausting. Some withdrew into silence. Others grew unusually irritable. Minor disagreements became more common, not because discipline had collapsed, but because the human mind was never meant to exist in such isolation. Letters from home could not arrive. Fresh news never came. The world beyond the Arctic might as well have ceased to exist. Back in Britain, families still believed the expedition was proceeding according to plan. Many expected Franklin to return within another year, carrying maps, discoveries, and stories that would astonish Europe. Children continued growing up. Parents celebrated birthdays. Wives waited patiently. None suspected that, thousands of miles away, the first invisible cracks had already begun spreading through the expedition. Not in the ships, not in the ice, but inside the men themselves. The Arctic had failed to destroy them quickly. Instead, it had begun something far more dangerous. A slow battle against their bodies, their minds, and eventually, their hope. As the second Arctic winter approached, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The expedition was no longer following its original plan. It was surviving. For more than a year, the Erebus and the Terror had remained locked inside the frozen wilderness. The crews had endured months of darkness. They had battled freezing temperatures, endless isolation, and the growing uncertainty of whether the ice would ever release them. Yet, through it all, one constant remained. Sir John Franklin. His calm presence had become the expedition's greatest source of stability. He continued meeting with his officers every day. He inspected the ships regularly. He encouraged discipline. He projected confidence, even when answers became increasingly difficult to find. No journal survives describing Franklin's private thoughts during those months. Perhaps he believed rescue would never be necessary. Perhaps he remained convinced that one final summer would free the ships. Or perhaps, like every experienced explorer before him, he had already begun to understand the terrible reality surrounding them. The Arctic was winning. As autumn settled over the frozen landscape once again, the condition of several crew members continued to decline. The weakness that had first appeared months earlier became more common. Simple tasks demanded extraordinary effort. Some sailors developed persistent coughing. Others struggled with swollen joints. Cuts healed slowly. Fatigue lingered no matter how much they rested. The ship's medical officers did everything they could. Fresh air was encouraged whenever weather allowed. Living quarters were cleaned constantly. Meals continued according to carefully planned schedules. But medicine in the mid-19th century had severe limitations. Many illnesses could be observed. Very few could truly be treated. Then, sometime during the early summer of 1847, tragedy struck. Sir John Franklin died. The exact date is known because of a remarkable document discovered years later. A handwritten note left inside a stone cairn on King William Island recorded the event with heartbreaking simplicity. It stated that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11th, 1847. He was 61 years old. The document gave no explanation, no description of illness, no account of his final hours, only the fact itself. The commander of Britain's greatest Arctic expedition was gone. His death changed everything. Leadership immediately passed to Captain Francis Rawdon Moyer Crozier, commander of the Terror, an experienced officer who spent much of his career navigating dangerous polar waters. Crozier possessed enormous experience. He understood Arctic survival better than almost anyone alive, but he inherited a situation unlike anything any naval officer had ever faced. 2 trapped ships, 128 exhausted men, no communication with Britain, no certainty that rescue would ever arrive, and now, no expedition leader. How Franklin died remains one of the great mysteries surrounding the expedition. Some historians believe illness finally claimed him after months of declining health. Others suggest complications related to scurvy. Still others point toward lead poisoning, pneumonia, heart disease, or a combination of several conditions acting together. The truth may never be known. No grave identified with certainty has ever revealed the answer. His body has never told its story. What is certain is the effect his death must have had upon the crew. Franklin was far more than a commanding officer. He represented purpose, authority, experience, hope. Many of the sailors had volunteered because they trusted him. His reputation had inspired confidence throughout Britain. If Franklin could no longer survive the Arctic, what chance did ordinary sailors have? Crozier understood that despair could spread faster than disease. He maintained strict discipline. The daily routine continued. Work continued. Scientific observations continued whenever possible. From the outside, the expedition remained organized. But beneath that discipline, morale had suffered a devastating blow. The men no longer spoke only about escaping the ice. Now they quietly wondered whether they would survive long enough to see another summer. Outside, the Arctic remained completely indifferent. Snow continued falling. The wind howled across the frozen plains. The ships groaned beneath enormous pressure from the surrounding ice. Nature offered no pause to mourn the expedition's leader. No moment of mercy. No sign that conditions might improve. The frozen wilderness simply continued doing what it had done for thousands of years. Waiting. Many historians believe Franklin's death marked the true turning point of the expedition. Before June of 1847, success still seemed possible. After his death, survival became the only objective. The dream of discovering the Northwest Passage quietly disappeared beneath the snow. Now every decision centered on one question. How could 128 men escape a prison that showed no intention of releasing them? No one aboard either ship yet realized how impossible that question would become, because the worst days of the expedition had not even begun. The death of Sir John Franklin changed more than the expedition's chain of command. It changed the way every man aboard the Erebus and the Terror looked toward the horizon. For nearly 2 years, the expedition had survived on one powerful belief, that eventually the ice would let them go. Now that belief was beginning to disappear. Captain Francis Crozier understood the reality better than anyone. Unlike many younger officers, he had spent years exploring the polar regions. He knew the Arctic did not care about courage, rank, or preparation. Nature rewarded patience only when it chose to, and lately it had chosen nothing but silence. The second winter proved even more difficult than the first. Food was still available, but not as plentiful as it had once seemed. The endless routine that had preserved discipline now felt like a reminder of captivity. Every morning began with the same frozen landscape. Every evening ended beneath the same lifeless sky. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. Nothing improved. The ships had become frozen islands. Entire worlds reduced to a few wooden rooms surrounded by hundreds of miles of ice. The officers continued inspecting the hulls. Although the reinforced ships remained standing, the pressure surrounding them had become terrifying. Sometimes enormous ridges of ice formed only a few yards away, rising into the air with explosive force. The sound echoed across the frozen wilderness like artillery. The wooden beams inside the ships groaned in response. Every sailor understood one frightening truth. If enough pressure built against the hulls, even these magnificent vessels could eventually be crushed. Meanwhile, the health of the crew continued declining. More men struggled with weakness. Others developed swollen legs. Persistent coughing became increasingly common. Several sailors who had once performed difficult physical labor with ease could barely complete ordinary duties. The surgeons worked tirelessly, but there were limits to what medicine could accomplish. No fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit, no proper sunlight, no possibility of evacuation. Everything depended on supplies already aboard the ships, and those supplies could not restore what months of isolation had slowly taken away. Captain Crozier faced impossible decisions every day. Should they remain aboard the ships and continue waiting? Or should they begin preparing for something far more dangerous? Leaving. For generations, Royal Navy officers have been taught one principle above almost every other. Never abandon your ship unless there is absolutely no alternative. A ship represented safety, shelter, food, warmth, navigation equipment, medical supplies, weapons, everything required for survival. Once a crew abandoned its vessel, its chances of surviving in the wilderness dropped dramatically. Crozier knew this. Every officer knew this. Every sailor knew this. Yet another reality had become impossible to ignore. If the ice never released the ships, remaining aboard guaranteed nothing. Waiting forever was not a strategy. It was surrender. During countless meetings, Crozier and his senior officers studied maps spread across wooden tables illuminated by oil lamps. They measured distances, estimated supplies, calculated the location of the nearest known trading posts operated by the Hudson's Bay Company. The numbers were horrifying. To reach civilization, the men would need to travel hundreds of miles across one of the harshest environments on Earth, on foot, pulling heavy sledges, crossing unstable sea ice, carrying whatever food they could transport. Even healthy men would struggle. Many of the expedition members were no longer healthy. Some officers suggested waiting another season. Perhaps the coming summer would finally break the ice. Others argued they had already waited too long. Every additional month weakened the crew further. Every delay reduced their chances of completing such an impossible journey. No surviving record tells us exactly what was said during those discussions, but history preserved the outcome. Eventually, a decision was made, one of the most painful decisions any naval commander could ever face. If the ships remained trapped, they would leave them, not immediately, not recklessly, but preparations quietly began. Extra clothing was gathered. Portable boats were inspected. Food supplies sorted according to what could realistically be carried. Weapons selected. Essential navigation instruments packed carefully. Every pound mattered. Every unnecessary object became a burden. Some sailors looked at the ships with sadness. For nearly 3 years, the Erebus and the Terror had been their homes, their protection, their final connection to civilization. Leaving them meant stepping into complete uncertainty. Yet there was another painful irony. The ships themselves still stood proudly above the ice. They had not sunk. They had not burned. They had not broken apart. They remained exactly where Britain had designed them to remain. Strong, magnificent, perfectly engineered, and completely useless. The greatest exploration vessels on Earth had been defeated not by poor construction, but by a sea that had simply stopped being a sea. Outside, another Arctic storm swept across the frozen plain. Snow erased footprints within minutes. The wind screamed to the rigging of ships that no longer sailed. Visibility disappeared into white emptiness. Standing on the deck, it became impossible to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Everything merged into one endless world of ice. Perhaps that was the Arctic's greatest weapon. It did not attack with violence alone. It attacked with hopelessness. It slowly convinced even the strongest men that escape might no longer exist. Soon, 105 surviving members of the Franklin expedition would take their first steps away from the safety of the Erebus and the Terror. They believed they were beginning the journey home. History would remember it as the beginning of the final tragedy. By April of 1848, nearly 3 full years had passed since the Franklin expedition had left England. 3 years, 3 Arctic winters, 3 summers that had failed to free the ships. Hope had not disappeared overnight. It had faded slowly, one frozen day at a time. On April 22nd, Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames made the most painful decision of the entire expedition. They would abandon HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The decision was later recorded in one of the most important historical documents ever discovered in the Arctic, written inside the famous Victory Point record. The officers summarized the expedition's unimaginable situation in only a few heartbreaking sentences. The note revealed that Sir John Franklin had died nearly a year earlier. It confirmed that both ships had remained trapped since September of 1846. It also contained another devastating fact. 24 officers and crew members were already dead. Out of the original 129 men who had sailed from England, only 105 remained alive. The dream of discovering the Northwest Passage had officially ended. Now there was only one objective: survive. The officers gathered the remaining crew and explained the plan. They would leave the ships behind forever. Their destination was a back river, far to the south. If they could somehow reach its banks, they hoped to find routes leading toward Hudson's Bay Company trading posts. Civilization still existed, but it was hundreds of miles away. Between them and safety lay one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. No roads, no villages, no rescue stations. Only ice, snow, rock, and endless uncertainty. Preparing to leave took several days. Every decision mattered. Every pound carried would eventually have to be pulled across frozen ground by exhausted men. Food became the highest priority. Flour, salted meat, tea, biscuits, small amounts of preserved vegetables. Anything that might keep a man alive one more day. Weapons were packed carefully, not for war, but for hunting. If fortune favored them, they might find seals, birds, or caribou along the journey. A few precious medical supplies were also selected. Bandages, basic medicines, surgical instruments. There would be no hospitals where they were going, only whatever they carried themselves. Navigation instruments followed, compasses, sextants, charts. Without them, finding the correct direction across the frozen wilderness would become almost impossible. Then came one of the strangest details discovered by later search expeditions. Many personal possessions were loaded onto the sledges. Silver cutlery, books, writing materials, even heavy decorative items that had little practical value. Modern historians have often wondered why. Perhaps the men believed civilization was only weeks away. Perhaps abandoning cherished belongings felt emotionally impossible. Or perhaps, after years of isolation, exhaustion had begun affecting judgment. Whatever the reason, every unnecessary pound would eventually demand more strength from bodies that were already failing. The expedition also prepared several large lifeboats mounted on heavy wooden sledges. The idea seemed logical. Whenever they reached open water or navigable rivers, the boats could carry them farther south. Until then, the men themselves would pull them. Each boat weighed hundreds of pounds before food and equipment were added. Moving them across uneven ice would require extraordinary effort. Still, no better alternative existed. Finally, the morning arrived. The officers gave the order. For the last time, the surviving crew stepped off the decks of the Erebus and the Terror. Some men turned back for one final look. Those ships had protected them for nearly 3 years. They had provided warmth, shelter, routine, hope. Now they stood silent behind them, frozen firmly into the Arctic landscape. Neither ship had sunk, neither had burned, neither had been destroyed. They simply remained where the ice had imprisoned them, waiting. No one knew it then, but those magnificent vessels will remain undiscovered for more than 160 years. The line of men slowly began moving south. Each sailor leaned forward against thick leather harnesses attached to the heavy sledges. Boots sank into soft snow. Frozen wind struck every exposed face. Progress was painfully slow. Some men could barely keep pace after only a few hundred yards. The boats refused to glide smoothly. Ice ridges blocked their path. Deep snow swallowed the runners. Every obstacle demanded another exhausting effort. When the crew reached rough terrain, dozens of men strained together, pulling with every ounce of strength they possessed. Sometimes the sledges moved only a few feet, then stopped again. Each step became a battle. Behind them, the Erebus and the Terror gradually disappeared into the endless white landscape. Their towering masts faded against the pale sky. Soon, only tiny dark shapes remained on the horizon. Then, nothing. For the first time since leaving England almost 3 years earlier, the Franklin expedition no longer had ships. 105 exhausted men now faced the Arctic exactly as it had always intended, on foot, alone, with hundreds of miles separating them from the nearest hope of rescue. Many historians believe this was the moment the expedition truly ended. Everything before had been exploration. Everything after would become a desperate struggle simply to stay alive. The moment the Franklin expedition abandoned its ships, every rule of survival changed. Aboard the Erebus and the Terror, the men had at least possessed shelter. Walls protected them from the wind. Stoves fought against the bitter cold. Beds offer a place to recover after exhausting days. Even trapped inside the ice, the ships had remained small islands of civilization surrounded by an unforgiving wilderness. Now, everything depended on the strength of their own bodies. The line of 105 survivors stretched slowly across the frozen landscape. Each man leaned forward against thick leather harnesses attached to enormous wooden sledges. Behind them rolled heavy lifeboats packed with food, equipment, weapons, navigation instruments, and a few possessions the officers believed could not be abandoned. Every step required effort. Every mile demanded sacrifice. The Arctic offered nothing freely. The terrain was far worse than many had hoped. From a distance, the frozen sea appeared flat. In reality, it resembled a shattered battlefield. Towering ridges of ice rose 20 or 30 feet into the air where enormous frozen sheets had collided during previous winters. Deep cracks crossed the surface without warning. Snow concealed dangerous holes beneath deceptively smooth drifts. The men could rarely walk in a straight line. Instead, they climbed, descended, circled obstacles, then climbed again. Often, dozens of exhausted sailors gathered around a single sledge, pulling together with ropes while others pushed from behind. Their boots slipped constantly. The runners became trapped. Progress slowed to an agonizing crawl. Some days they covered only a single mile. Other days, even less. Every evening, temporary camps had to be established before darkness and falling temperatures became overwhelming. Small tents offered limited protection from the wind. Whenever possible, snow walls were built around the camp to reduce exposure. Tiny cooking fires melted ice into drinking water. Simple meals were prepared from the carefully rationed supplies. No one ate until they were full. Every biscuit mattered. Every handful of flour mattered. Every ounce of meat represented another day of life. The officers kept strict records of food consumption. Rations were reduced whenever necessary. No one complained openly. They all understood the mathematics of survival. If they consumed too much too quickly, no one would reach civilization. Physical exhaustion soon became relentless. Pulling hundreds of pounds across broken ice demanded extraordinary energy. Yet the men no longer possessed extraordinary strength. Months of declining health had weakened them long before they left the ships. Muscles that once hauled heavy sails through violent storms now struggled against simple inclines. Breathing became labored. Legs trembled beneath the weight of constant effort. Several sailors collapsed during the march, forcing the expedition to stop while companions helped them back to their feet. No one wanted to leave a man behind. Not yet. Captain Crozier remained at the front whenever possible. His leadership no longer depended on issuing commands from the quarterdeck. Now he walked beside his men. He shared their exhaustion. He endured the same freezing winds. He accepted the same hunger. His presence inspired those who still had strength to continue. If the captain kept walking, so would they. The weather refused to cooperate. Blizzards appeared without warning. One moment the horizon remained visible. The next, everything disappeared. Snow filled the air so completely that men walking only a few yards apart became ghostly silhouettes. The expedition often stopped entirely, fearing someone might become separated and vanish into the storm forever. During calmer days, another danger emerged. The brilliant sunlight reflecting from endless snowfields burned the men's eyes. Many suffered painful snow blindness, forcing them to wrap cloth around their faces while navigating by instinct and memory. Every element of the Arctic seemed determined to take something from them. Strength, vision, hope, time. Despite everything, moments of humanity still survived. Some evenings, after tents had been raised and the day's march finally ended, small groups gathered quietly around weak cooking fires. Stories from home returned. Men spoke about wives waiting in England, children they hoped to see again, parents growing older, fields they wished to walk through one more time. Simple memories became precious. For a few minutes, they could almost pretend they were somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere alive. Those conversations rarely lasted long. Fatigue always won. One by one, the sailors wrapped themselves in frozen blankets and tried to sleep while the Arctic wind shook the tents throughout the endless night. Morning brought no relief. Only another day, another impossible distance, another battle against the sledges. Another reminder that civilization remained hundreds of miles away. The officers occasionally hunted whenever wildlife appeared. A bird overhead, a distant seal. Fresh meat became an extraordinary gift, not only because it eased hunger, but because it reminded the men that life still existed beyond the frozen emptiness surrounding them. Unfortunately, such opportunities became increasingly rare. Game was scarce. Ammunition could not be wasted. Every failed hunt cost valuable energy the expedition could scarcely afford. As the days passed, the pace slowed even further. The weakest men struggled to continue. The strongest found themselves pulling even greater loads. The expedition had become a test of endurance unlike anything the Royal Navy had ever imagined. This was no longer an organized exploration. It was a race against invisible enemies. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, distance, and time itself. Still, no one yet understood the cruel truth. The greatest obstacle standing between them and survival was not the ice beneath their feet. It was the unimaginable distance that still remained ahead. By the time the Franklin expedition had been marching across the Arctic for several weeks, the greatest enemy was no longer the cold. It was exhaustion. The men had entered the wilderness believing determination could overcome almost anything. Now they were discovering the painful limits of a human body. Every morning began with the same ritual. Frozen boots had to be loosened before they could even be worn. Blankets stiff with frost were rolled tightly and secured to the sledges. Ice was melted for drinking water. A small ration of food was distributed. Then, before the sun had climbed far above the horizon, the order to move was given once again. At first, everyone stood, everyone pulled, everyone walked. But as the days passed, that changed. The first man collapsed without warning while pulling one of the heavy lifeboats across a ridge of broken ice. His companions assumed he had slipped. 2 sailors hurried to help him stand. He tried. His legs simply refused. His breathing had become shallow. His face was pale beneath layers of frost. For several minutes he remained sitting silently in the snow, staring at the ground as though his body no longer belonged to him. Eventually, with assistance from 2 others, he managed to continue. Only a few hundred yards later, he collapsed again. This time no one spoke. Everyone understood what they had just witnessed. The strongest men among them were beginning to fail. As the march continued, similar scenes became increasingly common. One sailor developed such severe pain in his legs that he could barely lift his feet. Another found his hands trembling uncontrollably whenever he tried to grip the ropes attached to the sledges. Several men complained of dizziness whenever they stood too quickly. Others struggled to stay awake, even while walking. The officers adjusted the pace whenever possible. Frequent rest periods became necessary, but every stop created another problem. The longer they remained still, the colder they became. Muscles tightened. Boots froze harder. Fingers lost feeling. Rest provided relief from exhaustion while increasing the danger of hypothermia. Even stopping had become dangerous. Captain Crozier faced impossible choices every single day. Should the expedition slow down for the weakest men, or continue moving while there was still enough strength left in the majority? No decision felt humane. No decision guaranteed survival. The food situation also became increasingly complicated. Although supplies remained, every mile travel required an enormous amount of energy. The men were burning far more calories than they could replace. Their bodies began consuming themselves. Faces grew thinner. Cheeks hollowed. Uniforms that had once fit comfortably now hung loosely from exhausted frames. Even those who appeared healthy had begun losing dangerous amounts of weight. One evening, while preparing camp, several officers quietly discussed the enormous lifeboats they continued dragging behind them. Those boats had seemed essential when the journey began. If they reached open water, they might save everyone's lives. But reaching open water itself now seemed uncertain. Every additional pound demanded more strength. Every extra pound slowed the expedition. The debate lasted for hours. Could some equipment be abandoned? Could more personal belongings be left behind? The officers reluctantly agreed. Items once considered valuable suddenly became meaningless. Heavy books, extra tools, furniture, decorative silver, Anything that did not directly improve the men's chances of survival was quietly left behind on the ice. Each object represented another painful admission. They were no longer explorers. They were survivors. Still, even after reducing weight, progress barely improved. The Arctic continued resisting every step. The weather grew increasingly unpredictable. Powerful winds erased their tracks within minutes. Fresh snow concealed dangerous crevasses. Sometimes the expedition spent hours searching for a safe route around ridges of shattered ice that seemed to stretch forever. Distance became almost impossible to judge. The horizon never changed. The same white landscape surrounded them day after day. Some sailors began wondering privately whether they were making any progress at all. Others stopped asking how far remained. The answer no longer mattered. They simply walked until they could walk no farther. During one particularly difficult afternoon, another sailor collapsed. Then another, and another. Unlike earlier incidents, these men could not simply be helped back to their feet. Their bodies had reached complete exhaustion. Several companions removed the loads from their shoulders. Others offered water. A few shared portions of their already limited food. Nothing produced immediate improvement. The officers realized something terrifying. Strength alone would no longer determine who survived. Luck had entered the equation. A younger sailor might fail before an older one. A stronger man could collapse while someone smaller continued walking. The Arctic treated every human being differently. No rank, no experience, no courage offered immunity. That evening, silence filled the camp. The usual conversations about England became rare. Even memories required energy the men no longer possessed. Many simply stared into weak cooking fire, while snow drifted silently across the tents. Some wondered whether rescue parties had already begun searching. Others wondered whether Britain even knew they were missing. No answers came, only the endless wind. Captain Crozier walked quietly through the camp after darkness settled. He stopped beside several groups, speaking only a few words at a time. His voice remained calm, steady, confident, but even he could no longer hide one undeniable truth. The expedition was losing its race against the Arctic, not because the men lacked courage, not because they lacked discipline, not because they had stopped trying. They were losing because every mile demanded strength, and strength was something the frozen wilderness was taking from them, one step at a time. No one knew exactly when hope disappeared. There was no single moment, no dramatic speech, no final announcement. Hope simply grew smaller each day, fading like the weak Arctic sun behind another wall of drifting snow. The expedition continued moving south, but its pace had slowed to something almost unimaginable. The heavy sledges that once required effort now seemed impossible to move. Every yard demanded complete concentration. Every hill became a mountain. Every frozen ridge became an obstacle that consumed precious hours. The strongest men no longer looked strong. Their uniforms hung loosely from bodies that had lost enormous amounts of weight. Beards had grown wild beneath layers of frost. Faces were gaunt. Eyes appeared hollow. Hands shook constantly from exhaustion and cold. Many sailors had stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Conversation required energy. Energy had become their most valuable possession. Captain Crozier noticed another change. The line of marching men had become longer, not because more people had joined, but because the weakest could no longer maintain the pace. Small gaps appeared between sailors. The stronger men reached the next resting point first. The weaker arrived minutes later, sometimes much later. The expedition that had once moved with naval precision now resembled a scattered procession of exhausted survivors. One afternoon, a violent Arctic storm struck, with almost no warning. Dark clouds rolled across the frozen sky. The wind intensified within minutes. Snow rose from the ground in swirling waves, making it impossible to distinguish earth from sky. Visibility collapsed. Men walking only a few yards apart vanished behind curtains of blowing ice. Crozier immediately ordered the column to stop. Continuing would be suicide. The crew worked desperately to establish another temporary camp before the storm became even worse. Tents were raised against screaming winds. Snow walls were built as quickly as frozen hands allowed. The lifeboats were positioned to provide additional shelter. Every movement required teamwork. A single mistake could send equipment disappearing into the white darkness forever. That night became one of the coldest the survivors had experienced. The wind never stopped. It battered the tents relentlessly. Ice crystals forced their way through every opening. Sleeping bags stiffened beneath layers of frost. Several men woke repeatedly because they feared they might never wake again if they allowed themselves to sleep too deeply. Morning brought no comfort, only silence. The storm had passed. The landscape looked untouched, as though no human beings had ever crossed it. Only the expedition remained to prove otherwise. When the officers prepared the men to continue marching, they immediately realized something was wrong. Several sailors never emerged from their tents. At first, companions assumed they were simply exhausted. They called their names. No answer came. When they entered the shelters, they found men lying exactly as they had fallen asleep, peaceful, motionless. The Arctic had claimed them during the night. No battle, no cries, no struggle, only quiet. For several long moments, no one spoke. Death had accompanied the expedition before, but something about this morning felt different. These men had not died while climbing ridges or pulling impossible loads. They had simply reached the limit of what their bodies could endure. The surviving crew buried them as best they could beneath frozen stones and packed snow. Digging proper graves into permanently frozen ground proved nearly impossible. Simple markers were placed whenever possible. Many would never be found again. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes. There were no elaborate speeches, only silent respect. Then the order came to move. There was no alternative. Remaining beside the graves would only create more graves. As the expedition resumed its march, the emotional burden became almost heavier than the physical one. Every surviving sailor understood the same terrifying truth. Those who had died were not weaker men. Many had been experienced sailors. Some had survived battles. Others had survived previous Arctic expeditions. If they could fall, anyone could. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. For the first time, many no longer imagined returning to England. Instead, they thought about making it through another day, then another. The future had become too large to imagine. Survival existed only in 24-hour pieces. Food rations became even smaller, not because supplies had completely disappeared, but because the officers desperately tried to make them last. Each biscuit was carefully divided, each handful of flour measured, every cup of tea prepared with almost ceremonial precision. Nothing could be wasted. Meanwhile, the Arctic remained completely indifferent. The wind erased the fresh graves within hours. Snow covered footprints almost immediately. Nature showed no sign that human beings had ever passed through. It simply reclaimed everything. Crozier continued studying his maps each evening. The distances still remaining haunted him. Even under perfect conditions, the journey had been extraordinarily difficult. Now, perfect conditions no longer existed. The men moved more slowly every day. More deaths seemed inevitable, yet stopping meant certain death. Continuing offered only a possibility, and in the Arctic, a possibility was enough to keep walking. As another freezing sunset painted the horizon with pale shades of orange and blue, the remaining survivors prepared one more camp, one more fire, one more night. None of them realized they were approaching the point where organized survival would begin to disappear, and desperate instinct would take its place. Somewhere across the endless Arctic wilderness, the Franklin expedition reached a heartbreaking realization. They could no longer carry everything. The men had already abandoned personal belongings, heavy equipment, scientific instruments, books that had once filled long winter evenings, silverware that had represented civilization, even precious keepsakes brought from England. Still, the burden remained overwhelming. Every mile demanded more strength than the survivors could give. Captain Crozier understood that history might never know what happened to them. If every man died, the expedition would simply disappear. No explanation, no final report, no witness, only silence. That possibility forced the officers to think differently. If they could not save themselves, perhaps they could save the truth. Among the few written records historians later recovered was a remarkable document known today as the Victory Point Record. Its first message had been left during happier times, in May of 1847. At that point, optimism still survived. The note simply reported that the expedition had wintered successfully and expected to continue once conditions improved. Nothing suggested catastrophe. Nothing hinted at the nightmare unfolding around them. Almost 1 year later, everything had changed. The officers returned to the same document. This time, they wrote in the margins. The handwriting itself revealed urgency. The brief update recorded facts that would become priceless to future historians. Sir John Franklin had died. The ships remained trapped. 24 officers and men were already dead. The surviving 105 planned to abandon the vessels and march south under Captain Francis Crozier's command. The message contained no dramatic language, no emotional farewell, only facts, simple, professional, disciplined, exactly as Royal Navy officers had been trained to write. Yet beneath those carefully chosen words lay unimaginable suffering. Those few sentences became the expedition's final official voice. Everything that happened afterward would be reconstructed only through scattered clues. Before leaving the area, the officers carefully returned the message to its stone cairn. They hoped rescuers would eventually find it, perhaps months later, perhaps years later. What mattered was that someone would know. Someone would understand why the ships had been abandoned. As the expedition continued south, other traces were unintentionally left behind. Broken tools, empty food tins, pieces of clothing, wooden crates too heavy to transport farther. To the exhausted sailors, these objects meant little. To future search parties, they would become vital evidence. Years later, explorers would discover campsites where fires had once burned, scattered bones, discarded boots, fragments of uniforms still preserved by the Arctic cold. Each discovery answered one question, while creating several new ones. Why had certain valuable items been abandoned? Why had heavy silverware remained with some sledges, while food became increasingly scarce? Why were objects found miles apart that should have remained together? Historians still debate these mysteries today. Some believe exhaustion affected judgment. Others argue the men continued believing rescue was close enough that they would eventually recover everything they left behind. Whatever the explanation, every abandoned object tells the same story. The expedition was slowly surrendering pieces of itself to survive one more day. Meanwhile, the survivors continued walking. The column had become noticeably smaller. Deaths continued. Some men disappeared quietly during the night. Others collapsed during the march and never recovered. The officers recorded what they could, then kept moving. Stopping accomplished nothing. The Arctic showed no mercy to grief. Snow buried yesterday's footprints before noon. Wind erased campsites before sunset. The landscape consumed every sign of human existence with astonishing speed. One evening, after another exhausting day, several sailors climbed a nearby ridge hoping to see something different. Perhaps open water, perhaps distant land, perhaps wildlife. Instead, they saw only white, endless white, the same frozen wilderness stretching beyond the horizon in every direction. Some later searchers would describe the Arctic as beautiful. Those men no longer saw beauty. They saw distance, cold, and impossible silence. Captain Crozier unfolded his charts once again. He knew exactly where they hoped to go. But knowing the destination no longer meant they possessed the strength to reach it. The calculations had changed. Each day required more food, more energy, more lives. The arithmetic had become cruel. The expedition no longer measured progress in miles. It measured progress in survivors. Back in Britain, families still waited. Some wives continued writing letters. Parents confidently told neighbors that the expedition would surely return once the ice melted. Children imagined fathers bringing home stories of giant icebergs and strange northern animals. No one suspected those fathers were now leaving behind the last written words they would ever produce. No one imagined that decades would pass before anyone discovered those desperate messages hidden beneath carefully stacked Arctic stones. Today, those fragile pages remain among the most powerful historical documents ever recovered. not because they describe victory, but because they preserve something far more human. The final attempt of disciplined men to make sure the world would someday know that they had never stopped fighting. Long before European search parties reached the Arctic, there were already people who knew something terrible had happened. The Inuit. For thousands of years, Inuit communities had survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They understood the rhythm of the ice. They knew where seals gathered. They recognized the safest routes across frozen seas. Most importantly, they knew how to stay alive where outsiders rarely could. To the British Admiralty, the Arctic had often appeared as an empty wilderness waiting to be explored. To the Inuit, it was home. Every bay had a story. Every stretch of coastline held memories passed from one generation to the next. When Franklin's expedition disappeared, the Inuit became the only human witnesses to its final chapter. Years later, as rescue expeditions spread across the Canadian Arctic searching desperately for clues, British officers began speaking with Inuit hunters. At first, many of those conversations were dismissed. European explorers often underestimated indigenous knowledge, assuming their observations were unreliable or exaggerated. That proved to be a costly mistake. The Inuit described seeing strange ships trapped in the ice, large wooden vessels, unlike anything they had ever built themselves. They remembered groups of exhausted white men pulling enormous boats across the frozen landscape. The strangers moved slowly. Some appeared painfully thin. Others struggled to stand. The hunters noticed something else. The Europeans looked completely unprepared for Arctic survival. Their clothing, although impressive by British standards, was poorly suited for long overland travel in extreme polar conditions. Heavy wool became damp. Frozen fabric stiffened. Movement grew difficult. By contrast, Inuit clothing made from carefully prepared animal skins trapped warm air while remaining surprisingly light and flexible. For generations, that knowledge had meant the difference between life and death. The British had largely ignored it. The Inuit also described the survivors' desperate attempts to hunt. Some carried firearms. Others searched endlessly for seals and birds. But hunting in the Arctic required years of experience, knowing where animals traveled, understanding changing ice conditions, recognizing nearly invisible tracks, skills impossible to master during a desperate escape. Several Inuit later recalled meeting small groups of expedition members who appeared confused and physically exhausted. Communication proved extremely limited. Few shared a common language. Yet some messages required no translation. Hunger, fear, desperation. Those emotions could be recognized on any human face. One account described a sailor attempting to trade silver spoons for food. Another mentioned officers carrying elegant tableware, while lacking enough strength to pull their sledges efficiently. To later historians, these stories seemed almost unbelievable. Why would starving men continue carrying silver? The answer may never be fully known. Perhaps they still believed rescue was close. Perhaps abandoning symbols of civilization felt impossible. Or perhaps exhaustion had begun affecting judgment far more than anyone realized. As years passed, the Inuit shared increasingly disturbing observations. They spoke of abandoned camps, scattered equipment, bodies lying where they had fallen. Some were found inside tents. Others rested beneath makeshift shelters of stone. Many appeared to have died while still trying to move south. One particularly haunting account described a large boat resting on a heavy sledge. Inside were supplies, weapons, cooking equipment, and human remains. When British search parties eventually discovered that very boat years later, they found the Inuit descriptions astonishingly accurate. Nearly every detail matched. It became impossible to dismiss their testimony any longer. Perhaps the most important lesson came too late. The Inuit had survived the Arctic for centuries, not because they were stronger than nature, but because they respected it. They traveled light, adapted constantly, followed the seasons instead of fighting them, used local resources rather than depending entirely on supplies carried from distant lands. The Franklin expedition represented the opposite philosophy. Britain believed technology could overcome any obstacle. Stronger ships, more equipment, greater preparation. For a time, that confidence seemed justified. But eventually, The Arctic reduced every advantage to the same simple question. Could the human body continue? For many, the answer became no. As more rescue expeditions listened carefully to Inuit testimony, an extraordinary picture slowly emerged. The survivors had not disappeared all at once. They had struggled forward for weeks, perhaps months, fighting until the very end. Their story had never completely vanished. It had simply been preserved in memories instead of written records. Memories carried by people of the outside world had initially refused to believe. Ironically, without the Inuit, much of the Franklin expedition's final journey might have remained hidden forever. The greatest clues to one of history's most famous disappearances had not been locked beneath the ice. They had been waiting in the voices of those who had witnessed its final, heartbreaking moments. By the end of 1848, Britain could no longer ignore the silence. 3 years had passed since Sir John Franklin and his men had sailed away from England. No letters had arrived. No ship had returned. No official report had reached the Admiralty. At first, the lack of communication had not caused alarm. Arctic expeditions often disappeared from contact for long periods. The frozen North offered no reliable way to send messages. Many believed Franklin would simply appear the following summer with maps, scientific discoveries, and stories of triumph. But summer came, then another. Still, nothing. Families who had once celebrated the expedition now lived with growing uncertainty. Wives waited by windows that never saw familiar faces return. Children who had waved goodbye at the docks were becoming teenagers. Some barely remembered the fathers who had promised to come home. Parents aged while clinging to hope that one day a letter or a ship would finally arrive. Among those refusing to surrender was one remarkable woman, Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John Franklin's wife. She possessed extraordinary determination. While much of the government slowly accepted the possibility that the expedition had been lost, Lady Franklin refused to stop searching. She wrote letters, met politicians, raised money, spoke publicly. Again and again, she demanded that Britain continue looking. Without her persistence, many historians believe the search might have ended far sooner. Instead, it became one of the largest rescue efforts in exploration history. Over the following decades, dozens of expeditions entered the Arctic. Royal Navy vessels, private expeditions, American ships, whaling crews, scientists, explorers, all searching for the same answer. What happened to Franklin? Each new expedition carried hope. Perhaps survivors had established a camp. Perhaps one of the ships had escaped. Perhaps journals still waited inside an abandoned cabin. The Arctic answered every question with silence. Then, small clues began appearing. A pile of carefully stacked stones, an abandoned campsite, pieces of wood clearly shaped by human hands, scattered food tins. Each discovery suggested the expedition had passed nearby, but none explained its fate. One rescue party discovered 3 graves on Beechey Island. The headstones revealed the names of 3 young sailors who had died during the expedition's first winter: John Torrington, William Brain, John Hartnell. The graves were carefully maintained, orderly, respectful. They suggested discipline still existed during those early months. No evidence yet hinted at the terrible events that would follow. Years later, those graves would provide one of history's most astonishing archaeological discoveries. When researchers carefully examined the preserved bodies, the Arctic cold had protected them with incredible precision. Their faces remained recognizable after more than a century. Scientists found evidence suggesting unusually high levels of lead inside their bodies, reigniting debates about whether poisoning had contributed to the expedition's collapse. Still, questions outnumbered answers. Search parties continued pushing farther south. Again and again, they encountered Inuit communities. This time, explorers listened far more carefully. The stories remained remarkably consistent. Large ships trapped in ice, exhausted white men dragging boats, abandoned camps, bodies scattered across the land. Each testimony pointed investigators toward King William Island. Slowly, the map of the expedition's final movements began taking shape, not through journals, not through official reports, but through fragments, tiny pieces of a puzzle scattered across thousands of square miles. One of the most important discoveries came in 1859. Captain Francis Leopold McClintock located the famous Victory Point record. Inside its carefully protected stone cairn rested the expedition's final official message. The document confirmed Franklin's death. It confirmed the abandonment of the ships. It confirmed that 105 survivors had attempted to march south. For the first time, Britain finally knew the expedition had not vanished overnight. Its men had fought for survival until the very end. The discovery shocked the nation. Hope faded. Grief took its place. Yet even then, the greatest mystery remained unsolved. Where were the ships? For decade after decade, explorers searched without success. Many believed the Erebus and the Terror had been crushed beneath the ice. Others thought they had drifted into deep water before sinking. Some suggested they might still rest somewhere beneath the frozen Arctic Ocean, perfectly preserved. Generation after generation searched. Maps improved. Technology advanced. The Arctic slowly revealed more clues, but the ships themselves refused to appear. Time passed. The 19th century became the 20th. The 20th became the 21st. Children who had once waited for Franklin's return became grandparents. Entire nations changed. Wars reshaped the world. Empires rose and fell. Yet the Franklin expedition remained unfinished. One mystery continued surviving every generation. It seemed almost impossible that two enormous Royal Navy ships could disappear completely. And yet, for more than 170 years, that is exactly what they did. For more than a century and a half, the Erebus and the Terror existed almost like legends. Historians wrote books about them. Explorers retraced Franklin's route. Scientists debated endless theories. Artists painted dramatic scenes of ships trapped beneath towering walls of ice. Yet despite all the research, no one knew where the ships actually rested. Some believed they had been crushed beyond recognition. Others imagined them drifting endlessly beneath the frozen sea before finally sinking into the darkness. The Arctic kept it secret. Generation after generation searched. Each new expedition carried better maps, better equipment, better technology. Still, nothing. Then the 21st century changed everything. Modern science offered tools that Franklin's rescuers could never have imagined. Satellite imagery, side-scan sonar, high-resolution underwater cameras, precise GPS navigation. Entire sections of the Arctic seabed could finally be explored in extraordinary detail. Even so, the Arctic refused to surrender easily. Researchers spent years narrowing the search area. They carefully combined every available source of information: old British records, weather patterns, ocean currents, previous search reports. Most importantly, the oral histories preserved by Inuit families. For decades, Inuit hunters had described seeing one of the ships farther south than many European researchers believed possible. For years, those accounts received only limited attention. Now, modern search teams decided to trust them. It proved to be one of the most important decisions of the entire investigation. In September 2014, nearly 169 years after Franklin had sailed from England, a Canadian search expedition detected something unusual beneath the waters of Queen Maud Gulf. At first, it appeared only as an unfamiliar shape on sonar. Researchers knew better than to celebrate too quickly. The Arctic floor contained countless natural formations capable of producing misleading images. The team deployed remotely operated cameras. As the cameras descended through the freezing water, everyone aboard the research vessel watched in silence. The first images emerged slowly from the darkness. Wood, then iron, then unmistakable sections of a 19th century Royal Navy ship. The excitement aboard the vessel became impossible to contain. After generations of searching, one of Franklin's ships had finally been found. It was HMS Erebus. Remarkably, the wreck remained in astonishing condition. Cold Arctic waters had preserved much of the vessel. Its hull stood upright on the seabed. Cannons remained in place. Cabins still existed. Windows, deck structures, even personal objects lay exactly where they had rested since the 19th century. It felt less like discovering a shipwreck and more like opening a time capsule. News spread around the world within hours. Historians celebrated. Archaeologists prepared new expeditions. Descendants of Franklin's crew finally learned that part of the mystery had been solved. But one enormous question remained. Where was the Terror? 2 years later, the answer arrived. In 2016, another extraordinary discovery shocked the world. Guided once again by Inuit knowledge passed through generations, researchers located HMS Terror in Terror Bay. If the Erebus had been well preserved, the Terror seemed almost unbelievable. The ship rested peacefully beneath the water, as though it had only recently been abandoned. Its mast had collapsed over time, but much of the vessel remained remarkably intact. Doors still stood closed. Cabins appeared undisturbed. Glass windows survived. Shelves, drawers, tables. Everything suggested the Arctic had protected the ship with extraordinary care. Divers described an almost eerie feeling while exploring the wreck. The silence, the darkness, the knowledge that no living person had entered those spaces for more than 170 years. Every object told a story. A plate resting exactly where someone had left it. A bottle still standing upright. Navigation equipment, uniform buttons, pieces of rope. Each artifact connected modern researchers directly to the final days of the expedition. Excavations continue even today. Every season brings new discoveries, new objects, new clues, new questions. Scientists now analyze everything from preserved wood to microscopic traces of fabric. Advanced forensic techniques reveal details unimaginable only a few decades ago. Yet despite all this progress, many mysteries remain unsolved. Exactly how many men reached King William Island? How long did they survive after abandoning the ships? What conversations took place during those final weeks? Were Franklin's own journals? Did some crew members live longer than historians currently believe? The ships answered many questions. They did not answer them all. Perhaps they never will. The Arctic has always revealed its secrets slowly, patiently, on its own terms. What makes these discoveries even more remarkable is that they confirmed something historians should have understood much earlier. The Inuit had been right. For generations, they had preserved accurate memories of where the ships had gone. Modern technology eventually confirmed what human memory had protected all along. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries are not made by ignoring old knowledge. They are made by finally listening to it. After 170 years, the Erebus and the Terror were no longer myths. They were real, silent, resting beneath cold Arctic waters, waiting for the world to remember the men who had sailed aboard them. For nearly 2 centuries, historians have asked the same question. What actually destroyed the Franklin expedition? Was it the cold, the hunger, disease, poor decisions, or something far more complicated? The truth is both fascinating and deeply tragic. There was no single cause, no single mistake, no single moment when everything fell apart. Instead, the expedition slowly collapsed beneath the weight of several disasters unfolding at the same time. The Arctic did not defeat Franklin's men with one devastating blow. It defeated them piece by piece. The cold was the first enemy. Temperatures during Arctic winters regularly fell below -40 degrees. At those extremes, the human body burns enormous amounts of energy simply to stay warm. Every breath steals heat. Every movement consumes precious calories. Every mistake becomes dangerous. Even wearing the finest clothing available in 19th century Britain, the men constantly fought against freezing conditions that never truly disappeared. Then came hunger. Although the expedition had carried years of supplies, those calculations assumed the ships would continue moving. They assumed the crew would remain aboard warm vessels instead of dragging enormous sledges across frozen wilderness for weeks. Once the march south began, every day demanded far more energy than their rations could replace. The men entered a vicious cycle. The less they ate, the weaker they became. The weaker they became, the harder every mile became. The harder every mile became, the more food their bodies required. Eventually, the mathematics became impossible. Disease added another layer of suffering. Modern researchers believe many crew members suffered from scurvy, a disease caused by severe vitamin C deficiency. Although the expedition carried lemon juice intended to prevent it, historians still debate whether the preserved supplies retained enough vitamin C after years of storage. Scurvy attacked slowly. First comes fatigue, then swollen joints, bleeding gums, poor wound healing, muscles weaken. Eventually, even standing becomes difficult. A man suffering advanced scurvy can possess extraordinary courage, yet lack the physical strength to walk another mile. Lead poisoning remains one of the most controversial theories. During the 1980s, scientists studying several remarkably preserved crew members discovered unusually high concentrations of lead inside their bodies. The findings immediately attracted worldwide attention. Many researchers proposed that poorly manufactured food cans in the ship's water systems had slowly poisoned the expedition. Lead affects nearly every organ. It impairs judgment, weakens muscles, damages the nervous system, causes confusion and exhaustion. If the entire crew had experienced prolonged exposure, their ability to make life-saving decisions may have been compromised long before anyone recognized the danger. Yet the debate continues. Some modern studies suggest elevated lead levels were common among many 19th century sailors, meaning Franklin's crew may not have been uniquely affected. Others argue that while lead contributed to declining health, it cannot fully explain the expedition's collapse. The evidence remains incomplete. Another invisible enemy was isolation. Modern psychology has taught us much about prolonged confinement, months without change, without fresh faces, without meaningful progress, can slowly erode even the strongest minds. The Franklin expedition endured not weeks, but years. The same frozen horizon, the same small group of companions, the same uncertainty, every single day. Many historians believe psychological exhaustion played a far greater role than earlier generations realized. Hope itself became a limited resource. Then there was the simple geography of the Arctic. Maps often make distances appear manageable. Reality was different. The survivors attempted one of the longest overland escape efforts ever undertaken in polar history, across broken sea ice, through deep snow, while pulling enormous boats, without roads, without established camps, without reliable sources of food. Even modern expeditions supported by aircraft, satellite communication, insulated clothing, and advanced equipment approach such journeys with enormous caution. Franklin's men attempted it, carrying 19th century technology against one of the harshest environments on Earth. Some critics have questioned the officers' decisions. Why carry heavy silverware? Why continue pulling lifeboats? Why not adapt more fully to Inuit survival techniques? Those questions are understandable, but they are also easy to ask from the safety of modern history. The officers made decisions while exhausted, hungry, cold, and operating with incomplete information. Every choice they made involved uncertainty. Every option carried enormous risks. There were no perfect answers. Perhaps the greatest lesson left by the Franklin expedition is not that its leaders failed. It is that there are limits to preparation. Britain possessed the world's strongest navy, the most advanced ships, experienced officers, years of supplies, scientific confidence, national pride. Still, nature proved stronger, not because human courage was insufficient, but because courage alone cannot negotiate with ice. Today, historians no longer view the Franklin expedition simply as a failed exploration. They see something much larger, a story about ambition, about confidence, about the fragile line separating human achievement from human vulnerability. The expedition failed to discover the Northwest Passage, but it succeeded in teaching future generations one unforgettable lesson. The greatest danger in exploration is not always what you fail to prepare for. Sometimes it is believing you have prepared for everything. When the last survivor of the Franklin expedition drew his final breath somewhere across the frozen Arctic, the Northwest Passage remained unconquered. The mission had failed. 129 men had sailed from England. Not one returned home. By almost every measure imaginable, the expedition had ended in complete disaster. And yet, history has a strange way of judging success. At first, Britain mourned. Newspapers that had once celebrated the departure of the expedition now printed stories filled with uncertainty and grief. Families accepted losses that had taken years to understand. Some never learned exactly where their loved ones died. Others never discovered whether fathers, husbands, or sons had survived weeks or months, longer than anyone imagined. The Arctic had stolen not only lives, it had stolen certainty. For decades, the Franklin expedition became a symbol of tragedy. Many questioned whether the search for the Northwest Passage had been worth such enormous sacrifice. Others criticized the decisions made by the expedition's leaders. Some even wonder whether the Arctic should simply be left alone forever, but explorers are rarely discouraged for long. Every expedition leaves something behind, even failed ones. The countless rescue missions launched to search for Franklin dramatically expanded the world's understanding of the Canadian Arctic. Coastlines were mapped, new islands were documented, unknown waterways appeared on navigation charts. Future explorers benefited from knowledge purchased at an unimaginable human cost. Ironically, the expedition that failed to discover the Northwest Passage inspired the discoveries that finally completed the map. In 1906, more than 60 years after Franklin's ships vanished, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen successfully navigated the Northwest Passage. Unlike many earlier expeditions, Amundsen approached the Arctic differently. He traveled with a much smaller crew. He learned directly from the Inuit. He adopted their clothing, their hunting techniques, their methods of traveling across snow and ice. Instead of trying to conquer the Arctic, he adapted to it. Many historians believe the lessons learned from Franklin's tragedy quietly influenced every successful polar expedition that followed. Engineers redesigned ships. Explorers carried lighter equipment. Greater attention was given to nutrition. Respect for indigenous Arctic knowledge steadily increased. The Franklin expedition had failed, but future explorers survived because they studied why it had failed. Even today, archaeologists continue recovering remarkable artifacts from the Erebus and the Terror. Every spoon, every journal fragment, every button, every piece of rope, every preserved cabin. Together, they tell a story far richer than historians once believed possible. This is no longer simply the story of a lost expedition. It is the story of real people. Young sailors who dreamed of adventure, experienced officers who accepted extraordinary responsibility, doctors who cared for the sick with limited medical knowledge, engineers who trusted the finest technology of their age, families who waited years for loved ones who would never return. For much of history, the Franklin expedition became famous because of its mystery. Today, it deserves to be remembered for something greater, its humanity. These were not reckless men chasing glory. They were professionals attempting one of the greatest geographical challenges of the 19th century, using the best knowledge available to them. They accepted risks that few people would willingly face, not because success was guaranteed, but because exploration has always demanded courage beyond certainty. There is another reason this story continues to resonate. Every generation sees something different within it. Some see ambition, others see overconfidence. Some see the dangers of ignoring local knowledge. Others see the extraordinary resilience of ordinary human beings placed in impossible circumstances. Perhaps all of those interpretations are true. The Franklin expedition reminds us that history is rarely simple. Heroes are not always victorious. Failure is not always meaningless. Sometimes the greatest contribution a person makes to history is not what they achieve, but what others learn from their sacrifice. The Arctic eventually revealed the ships. It revealed camps, graves, personal belongings, even pieces of the final journey. But one thing it never erased was the determination of the men who continued walking long after hope itself had begun to disappear. They did not surrender at the first obstacle. They did not abandon one another when conditions became unbearable. They fought against cold, against hunger, against distance, against time, until their strength was finally gone. Few people remember every one of their names today. Fewer still could identify their faces. Yet their story survives, not because they reached their destination, but because they refused to stop trying. And perhaps that is the truest measure of courage. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Franklin expedition disappeared into the Arctic. Empires have risen and fallen. Technology has transformed the world. Human beings have walked on the moon. Satellites now orbit the Earth, photographing places that 19th century explorers could barely imagine. And yet, the story of those 129 men still possesses the power to humble us, because despite everything humanity has achieved, there remain places capable of reminding us how small we truly are. The Arctic is one of them, standing today on the shores of King William Island. It is difficult to imagine the scale of what happened there. The landscape appears almost timeless. Snow stretches toward the horizon. Cold winds continue sweeping across frozen water. The silence remains as overwhelming as it must have been in 1848. Nature shows almost no sign that one of history's greatest exploration tragedies unfolded there. It simply continues existing, as it always has. The Franklin expedition is often remembered as a mystery, but perhaps mystery is only one part of its legacy. The deeper lesson lies elsewhere. It reminds us that progress has never come without sacrifice. Every map hanging inside a classroom, every shipping route connecting continents, every scientific discovery expanding humanity's understanding of the planet exists because someone accepted extraordinary risks. Most explorers returned home. Some never did. Franklin's men belonged to the second group. Their names slowly disappeared from public memory, not because their journey lacked importance, but because history often celebrates success more loudly than sacrifice. Victorious expeditions become legends. Failed expeditions quietly fade away. That is profoundly unfair. Failure does not erase courage. It does not erase determination. It does not erase the willingness to step into the unknown for the benefit of generations yet to come. In many ways, the Franklin expedition succeeded far beyond what its members could ever have imagined, not by completing the Northwest Passage, but by teaching the world how to survive the Arctic more wisely. Future explorers traveled differently because of them. Scientists learned from them. Engineers redesigned equipment because of them. Historians reshaped their understanding of exploration because of them. Even modern archaeologists continue making discoveries because those ships remain preserved beneath the cold northern waters. Their story is still unfolding. Every new artifact recovered from the Erebus or the Terror adds another sentence to a narrative that seemed lost forever. A handwritten label, a cooking utensil, a navigational instrument, a fragment of clothing. Each object reminds us that history is not built from abstract events. It is built from human lives, from ordinary people making extraordinary decisions. Perhaps that is why the Franklin expedition continues capturing imaginations around the world. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How far will we go in pursuit of discovery? How much comfort will we sacrifice to achieve something greater than ourselves? At what point does courage become obsession? Where is the line between determination and impossible hope? There are no easy answers. Perhaps there never will be. But one truth remains impossible to ignore. Those men never stopped moving forward, even after their commander died, even after the ships became prisons, even after hunger weakened their bodies, even after hope itself began slipping away. They continued walking, step after painful step, toward a horizon they believed might still lead home. That image has survived longer than any map they hoped to draw, longer than any scientific report they intended to publish, longer than the empire that sent them north. 129 men sailed into the Arctic believing they were about to change history. They did, just not in the way anyone expected. Today, visitors can stand inside museums and look at objects recovered from the Erebus and the Terror. They can see boots worn by exhausted sailors, tools once held by frozen hands, fragments of the world those men carried with them into the ice. But no museum can fully preserve what mattered most: their determination, their resilience, their refusal to surrender, while even the smallest possibility of survival remained. That is something no artifact can display. It lives only in the story, and stories survive only if someone chooses to remember them. Perhaps that is why this journey still matters, not because it ended in triumph, but because it revealed the extraordinary strength and the undeniable limits of the human spirit. History almost forgot them. The Arctic almost erased them. But as long as their story continues to be told, they are not truly lost. History has a habit of celebrating victories. We remember the explorers who reached their destination, The inventors whose creations changed the world. The leaders who returned home, the cheering crowds. Success fills textbooks. Failure often disappears into the margins. That is why the Franklin expedition is so extraordinary, because despite ending in tragedy, it deserves to be remembered alongside humanity's greatest achievements. 129 men left England believing they were taking part in a mission that would reshape the map of the world. They trusted their commander. They trusted their ships. They trusted the finest science and engineering their generation could offer. Most of all, they trusted that no challenge was beyond human determination. What they encountered was something entirely different, a force that could not be negotiated with, a wilderness that recognized no empire, no rank, no ambition, no dream. The Arctic treated every man exactly the same, captain and sailor, officer and engineer, young recruit and seasoned veteran. In the end, all were simply human. For many years, people spoke about the Franklin expedition only as a mystery. Where were the ships? How did the men die? What happened during those final weeks? Those questions are important, but perhaps they are not the most important ones. Perhaps the better question is this: what can their story teach us today? It teaches us that courage is not measured only by success. Sometimes courage is continuing after success is no longer guaranteed. It teaches us that knowledge has limits. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, nature still deserves respect. It teaches us that wisdom can come from unexpected places. The Inuit understood the Arctic because they learned to live with it instead of trying to defeat it. That lesson remains just as valuable now as it was nearly 200 years ago. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that no sacrifice made in the pursuit of knowledge is truly meaningless. The Franklin expedition never completed its mission, but future explorers succeeded because they learned from its mistakes. Future engineers designed better equipment because of its failures. Future generations understood the Arctic more deeply because these men dared to enter it first. That is a legacy few people ever achieve. Today, the Erebus and the Terror rest quietly beneath Arctic waters. They no longer battle storms. They no longer fight drifting ice. They become silent monuments beneath the sea, protected by the same cold that once trapped them. Occasionally, archaeologists descend into that frozen darkness. Their lights sweep across cabins untouched for generations, across bottles still standing upright, across tools waiting exactly where tired hands left them, across corridors where footsteps have not echoed since the 19th century. Each discovery feels almost sacred, not because of the objects themselves, but because every artifact reminds us that these were real people, men who laughed together, shared meals, wrote letters home, dreamed about returning to their families. Their lives were not legends. They were human stories. And perhaps that is why this journey continues to move us. We recognize ourselves in them, our curiosity, our ambition, our hope, our willingness to believe tomorrow will be better than today. The Franklin expedition failed to conquer the Arctic, but it succeeded in revealing something far more enduring: the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. History almost allowed those men to disappear. The Arctic almost buried every trace of their existence beneath snow, ice, and silence. Almost, because stories have a remarkable power. As long as someone is willing to tell them, the people within them never truly vanish. Tonight, we remembered 129 men who sailed toward the unknown, believing they could change the world. In many ways, they did, not through victory, but through sacrifice, not through triumph, but through perseverance, not through reaching their destination, but through reminding every generation that the pursuit of discovery has always demanded extraordinary courage. So the next time you hear someone say that history belongs only to the winners, remember the Erebus, remember the Terror, remember the men who walked into the endless white horizon, knowing every step might be their last. Because some of history's greatest heroes are not the ones who return home. They are the ones whose courage continues to guide us, long after they were gone. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's greatest forgotten expeditions. If you enjoy stories that uncover the people history almost erased, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we explore remarkable true stories of courage, sacrifice, and forgotten lives that helped shape our world. Until next time, thank you for remembering the men the ice could not erase.